Welcome everyone who is just joining our Public Pharma panel. We are so glad to have you here. While you are streaming in, please be sure to put your name in the chat, where you're from, what org you're with, what you're excited to learn about. Let's get started. I'm very excited about this panel on public pharmaceuticals. For those of you who haven't been in a previous panel with me, I'm Pete Davis, director of the Democracy Policy Network, or DPIN for short. I said this in our social housing panel, but for those of you who weren't there, I think I should say it again because it really applies here, which is that there's been an amazing development in the past decade, which is that we as a country have rediscovered a fundamental truth about solving public problems, which is that there are many alternative ways of solving them. We do not have to limit ourselves, whether it's in housing or in pharmaceuticals, to models that happen to align with the interests of the wealthy and powerful. One such model we are discovering that's as true for social housing as it is for public pharma is public enterprise. We collectively, through our government, deciding to, as we have done multiple times before and multiple governments around the country, around the world are doing, and in many ways we are doing as well, rediscovering that we can help make things that people need. And one of the most promising examples of public enterprise is public pharmaceuticals, the government stepping in to help produce and distribute the medicines that we need at higher quality and lower cost. There's been a wave of legislation around this from California to Maine, interest in Michigan, really exciting bill in Washington to do this. And we are excited to have folks here today who are experts and advocates on this topic. We're going to go through all the panel, then we're going to take your questions. So as soon as people are done with their intros, start dropping questions in the chat and we'll hope to get to them. But all these panelists will be around trying to answer in the chat, answering on here, and sharing their info so you can get contacted with them later. Let's get started with the lead expert of public pharma in this country, who we are so honored to have here, which is Dana Brown, who is the Director of Health and Economy at the Democracy Collaborative, where her research has focused for years on health and care systems, the pharmaceutical sector, and the economic transformation of health and well-being. And I call her the lead expert on this because she wrote the darn document on it that's re-kicked this all off, which is Medicine for All, the case for a public option in the pharmaceutical industry. An amazing report, and has been, more importantly than just writing it up, also advocating, agitating, pushing the ball forward on this and helping people out in states all across the country. So without further ado, giving us an overview of what public pharmaceuticals is and the state of it and how you can bring it to your state, Dana Brown.
Thank you so much, Pete. It's really great to be here with all of you today. If you can't tell, I'm embarrassed now, but quite humbled, and just really thrilled to be here alongside my fantastic collaborators, Allison and Chris, who you'll hear from in a moment. I want to say I'm thrilled to be here at Statehouse Futures talking about public pharma for the second time, because there has been so much progress since we talked last year, and I really can't wait to discuss it all with you, so I'm just going to dive right in. You may have heard in the news recently that the state of California plans to produce and distribute its own insulin, naloxone, and other essential medicines. And my wonderful co-presenters will tell you more about that. But I want to start by saying why such an initiative is so important and what the benefits to our society could be. Most of you probably know that the US pays the highest prices for prescription drugs in the world, and that has serious consequences for our society. But the problem with the US pharmaceutical industry goes far beyond high prices. Distorted incentives in an industry oriented solely around the goal of maximizing profits produce several interrelated adverse trends for our health, our economy, and our democracy, from routine shortages to corruption and regulatory capture. The US pharmaceutical industry in its current form is highly extractive. That is, much of the money that we put into the sector actually leaves the productive economy, that real work of discovering and producing medicines, and it goes to the finance and insurance sector, lining the pockets of shareholders and executives at the expense of the rest of us. Very briefly, the public is doubly taxed for pharmaceuticals because the public funds the majority of the basic science behind drug discovery, but then of course we all pay again for our prescriptions through out-of-pocket costs, insurance premiums, and more. Prescription prices are further inflated because pharmaceutical companies make huge outlays on marketing, usually about double what they do in R&D. Big pharma companies are highly financialized, routinely distributing more than 100% of profits to shareholders, generating that extra cash by downsizing, reducing reserves, selling off assets, taking on debt, and laying off employees. The industry is also known for rampant tax evasion, which further impacts the available public funding, which could be used for upstream investments in our health. So all in all, there's a lot of money leaving the productive economy in this sector. And here, in the richest country in the history of the world, the effects of this extraction are particularly striking. A reported 1/4 to 1/3 of all Americans report not taking medications as prescribed due to cost. The profit fuel opioid epidemic has decimated innumerable communities. Much of the costly innovation coming from the pharmaceutical industry is actually clinically meaningless, what we call Me Too drugs that are just copies of things that are already on the market with small tweaks. Drug shortages are on the rise, and in fact, they're near an all-time high right now in 2023. These deleterious trends are the natural outcomes of an industry oriented around the singular goal of maximizing profit. To get different outcomes, we need a different design, and that's where partnership comes into play. Because they're not beholden to shareholders or driven by market imperatives, public pharmaceutical enterprises are free from the constraints of profit maximization. They can instead define their bottom line based on different imperatives, such as the value of their contributions to public health, scientific advancement, and local economies. Public production can be a source of good, stable public sector jobs where women and people of color enjoy higher rates of employment, where there's also greater unionization and worker protections are more robust than in the private sector. These could be the manufacturing jobs of the future. The way I see it, rather than tinkering around the edges and trying to combat each market failure after it occurs, public production offers a proactive, transformative approach that begins to shift the balance of power back towards the public interest when it comes to the utterly critical supply of essential medicines in the United States. Think about it. Publicly produced medicines could be distributed at or below cost, even for free, because they have positive externalities for society. This already happens in places like Brazil, where public labs have been key to producing a supply for the Popular Pharmacies program, which distributes over 100 medications to low-income patients for free or deeply reduced prices. It's also the reason why things like public education and transportation are generally free or highly subsidized, even here in the US, right? We recognize the huge benefits that it provides to society and the economy. This idea is not new. Medicines and medical devices of all types are produced at small and large scales in public sector institutions around the world, from the UK to Sweden, Thailand, India, Cuba, Argentina, and more. Here in the United States, the state of Massachusetts has been producing vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and other biologics in the public sector for 125 years at Mass Biologics. Public health departments across the country have developed and distributed drugs like antitoxins, vaccines, and immunoglobulins at various points in US history. Until 1998, Michigan produced vaccines and other biologics through its Michigan Biologics Laboratory, including rabies and anthrax vaccines, which were critical to public health and national security. Many of these products were distributed for free to Michigan residents, and some were sold at cost to other states through contracts with NGOs. So where are we today, right? In addition to California, Massachusetts, and Michigan, Washington passed broad legislation a couple of years ago, written to allow for numerous approaches, including public-public partnerships with states like California or others to procure publicly produced medicines. Bills to authorize public production of generic medicines have been introduced in New York and Illinois and are under discussion in other states. Maine passed a study bill and recently completed its initial report on the benefits and challenges of producing insulin in the public sector there. State public pharmaceutical efforts could be the beginning of large-scale regional initiatives to create a new public interest and democratically controlled market for essential medicines, particularly if linked with existing initiatives like the growing ArrayRx program in the Northwest or state single-payer initiatives. Right? And together, these efforts can really begin to shift the balance of power in a critical industry back towards the public and wrest some of that huge public investment in the industry out of financial markets and put it back into the productive work of making and distributing essential medicines. Simply by assuring that Big Pharma is no longer the only game in town, the only folks making medicine, that changes the balance of power, and it creates space for other things like price negotiations and transparency measures, which so many of you have worked for so long. So to close, I'll leave you with two summary points. One, States can and do produce high-quality, low-cost essential medicines. 2, there are important co-benefits to public pharmaceutical efforts, right? It can be a jobs program. It can bring down total healthcare spending over time. It can free up needed state resources for other efforts. It can help reduce regulatory capture by making sure that Big Pharma is not the only game in town. It can make Medicare for all plans more realizable and more sustainable by reining in drug prices, and more and more and more. So we're going to talk about all of that with you today. With that, I'll pass it back to Pete, and very happy to answer questions as they come through the chat.
Thank you so much, Dana. We dropped a link to Dana's report. We dropped a link to a Deepen Policy Kit that Dana helped put together recently on this, and more questions coming later. Keep dropping your questions in the chat. One thing I just like to call out that I've heard a lot is, there was a lot of energy around Medicare for All a couple of years ago. And I think one of the things that's inhibiting it continuing is because people are starting to become aware that we aren't just going to need a fight on the demand side, funding for you to receive healthcare as an individual. We also have to have a fight on the supply side, because if we have, a great increase in Medicare for All, but we don't fix the supply side of how our hospitals run, how our doctors run, and how our pharmaceuticals run, we're not going to have a successful program that we want to have. And so we need to open up fronts on both of these fights. And that's why we at Deepen have been so excited about public pharma, because it is one of the ways to fight for a deeper democracy on the supply side of medicine and care. So glad for Dana fighting for this. Now let's move to an advocate who has pushed around these issues in a particular state. So many of you in the audience are people wondering, how can I champion this in my city and state across the country? And we have some advocates that have fought for this. And we have a great one. His name is Chris Noble here. He is with Health Access California, a major force behind California's fight for public pharma, for cheaper insulin, and so many other health access and advocacy in the nation's biggest state that usually, which is harder than your average state to fight for in. So a real seasoned advocate here. So Chris, tell us a little bit about the fight for this in California.
Sure, great. Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Dana, for your comments. That's why she's the expert. It's great here to be with Dana and Allison on this panel. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Noble. I'm the organizing director with Health Access California, California's statewide consumer health advocacy coalition, as well as a person living with insulin-dependent diabetes for coming on 30 years now. I'm going to be talking about what we're doing here in California, hopefully inspire. I see many folks here on the call are actually policymakers in other states, so hopefully this can inspire actions elsewhere. But yeah, to give a quick rundown, California has led on a number of different efforts to rein in prescription drug prices over the years, including the passage of one of the first prescription drug price transparency bills back in 2017, and putting an end to pay for delay practices by the pharmaceutical industry back in 2019. Now, the really exciting thing starts kicking off when Governor Newsom took office in 2019. His office did run initially on a fairly ambitious single-payer platform that did include some commitments to taking on significant prescription drug price reforms. So in addition to launching what was called the Medi-Cal RX program, or as the governor called it, the Single Payer for Prescription Drugs program, which was an effort to consolidate the state's ability to negotiate for more affordable prescription drug prices on behalf of nearly 13 million Medi-Cal beneficiaries. That's our state Medicaid program. The governor also and the state legislature included funding in that 2019 state budget to begin researching the public manufacturing of generic drugs that would later be called the CalRx program. So this initial policy, it directed the state to investigate what it would take to manufacture up to 10 different generic medications in an effort to sidestep the otherwise highly litigious attempts to regulate pharmaceutical prices directly. This was tried in many states at the time, and really we were just hitting brick wall after brick wall of the pharma lobby kind of rising up and shutting down those efforts. So this is a way to work around that. And given California's large population size, the fact that 40% of the state are on state programs, namely Medicaid, and investing in the state's own production of widely used, high-cost generic prescription drugs was certainly a cost-saving measure to not only the state and those essential public health programs, but also, more importantly, to the consumers dependent on a steady supply of these affordable medications. So additionally, considering the state would be simply making its own off-patent medications at or near the cost of production, these life-saving efforts would not elicit the same legal concerns like other efforts to regulate pharma directly have, and could theoretically provide a downward market pressure by providing these at-cost medications beyond California's borders. And that's not just theoretical, actually. We have seen a significant drop in insulin prices from the big three manufacturers that maybe Allison will be getting into, but that downward market pressure was a component of this program, so that there is now a $30 insulin on the market to challenge the over $300 a vial prices seen from the pharmaceutical industry. So that downward market pressure is already being seen. But honestly, this is all due to the strong advocacy of patients under the Insulin for All banner. So shout out to Type 1 International, shout out to all the organizers and advocates fighting for Insulin for All. I see your poster in the background there, Allison. That's amazing. But because of that advocacy, insulin became the poster child of this harmful prescription drug price system in the US. And so it was chosen as the initial pilot project for this newly launched CalRx program. So unfortunately, then came 2020, and we all remember what happened then. The momentum that built up in the 2019 budget was halted to reprioritize to the much needed emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But fortunately, later on in 2022, the governor recommitted the state to the CalRx vision by calling for additional funding to kickstart this program. So now in 2022 budget, it ended up including an additional $100 million, $50 million of which was allocated to the first step of the program, which entails partnering with an established biosimilar manufacturer for the production of a California branded insulin in the short term. This is in the 1 to 3 year time frame, according to what we're hearing so far. The second $50 million was to look into building in-state manufacturing capacity, which would allow for our own eventual supply here at the state level in the 3 to 5 year time range. But those are obviously very rough estimates. In this year's State of the State tour, Governor Newsom did announce a partnership with biosimilar manufacturer Civica RX. It's a nonprofit biosimilar manufacturer that would bring CalRx insulin to market by the ambitious timeline of 2024. So we'll see if they're able to hit that timeline for a $30 per vial price point for analog insulins. And I believe they're bringing 3 different analog insulins to market, or a pack of 5 pens. So for people who are not diabetics like myself, that would last about 2 weeks, and you can just out of pocket expect paying well over $300 for that one vial. So this is a 10 times reduction in that price, which we do know that it costs $5 to $10 to manufacture a vial of insulin. So the $30 price range, taking into account supply chain distribution and actually selling at the point of sale, it's within the range of really at the cost to manufacture and distribute. So this is an ambitious timeline, 2024, given these new insulins will still require the necessary clinical trials and subsequent FDA approvals. And additionally, it did become clear that Civica RX would be directed to supply California's insulin under the CalRx label and would use the revenue generated to build up additional manufacturing capacity to supply Civica RX biosimilar insulin elsewhere around the country at that same $30 per vial price. So that's that downward market pressure. It's also important to note that this year's budget included an additional $30 million to support a partner or partners in developing, manufacturing, procuring, and or distributing a naloxone nasal product through the CalRx label. So they're already expanding on the initial package of just introducing insulin. They've now introduced naloxone. The state has also negotiated the ability to purchase up to 2 million misoprostol pills as needed through CalRx. To support other states in securing misoprostol at a low cost, California has shared the negotiated terms of the purchase agreement with all states as a part of the Reproductive Freedom Alliance. So the program is expanding. Some lingering questions in our mind we have included is what the vision is for the state-based manufacturing facility, especially after the 10-year Civica RX contract expires. One could see a future where this in-state facility is wholly publicly owned and operated by in-house expertise. It could also be the case that the Civica contract is extended indefinitely, making California's CalRx program and Civica RX's fates intertwined. Additionally, we'll be watching to see how well these new insulins are incorporated into existing drug formularies, whether a direct consumer purchasing option will be considered for people with active prescriptions, and possibly most important, to what degree these new formulations will be taken up and be safe for people with diabetes and their prescribing care team. So we're not sure what other generic medications might end up for consideration in the CalRx program, but if we did learn anything from the Insulin for All advocacy, patient advocacy is the strongest tool out there to drive state policy solutions like this. Thank you all. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. So appreciate that story of your work and very exciting things happening in California. Keep dropping questions in the chat. All you folks in the audience, we'll see if we can get to them by the end of the session, and people are also answering in the chat too. So get your answers by dropping questions in the chat. Our final panelist today is Allison Hardt, who is the Community Development Director with T1 International, a great organization. It's an advocacy group for folks with type 1 diabetes. Allison, could you share a bit about your advocacy for the government getting involved in insulin production and distribution, insulin for all generally, the fight for kind of more affordable insulin?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me today. As Pete said, I'm Allison Hardt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. And I am the Community Development Director at T1I. We are an independent global diabetes nonprofit led by people with and impacted by type 1 diabetes for people with type 1 diabetes. But while we focus on type 1 diabetes, we fight for insulin access for anyone who needs it, as well as for wider access to medicines as a whole. And my role for the past 3 years, I've been working with our incredible network of grassroots volunteer advocates in our 41 state chapters. As Chris mentioned, patient advocacy, very powerful. So we've been working to create long-term change, a lot of times through policy, through legislative action, for insulin access and affordability. I originally joined T1I as a volunteer when I was in Pennsylvania, with the Pennsylvania chapter, after my partner, who has had type 1 for 38 years, had several scary and frankly demoralizing experiences trying to access his insulin. And so I came to this work, as so many advocates do, which is out of sheer frustration and just being done with the status quo. And that's what is really exciting about public manufacturing, is that it's a chance to work outside of those current dominant structures, as Dana and Chris have both said. And I think in this room, the current system, for getting people medicines that they need is broken between for-profit manufacturers, PBMs, and insurance. And that, as Chris said, insulin has been the poster child for the problems with prescription drug pricing, with 1 in 4 patients with type 1 rationing their insulin. And I think, at T1 International, it's been really central to our mission that we work on priorities that are guided by our community. And so I want to share a little bit about how public pharma became a priority, and also how we've been framing our work so that advocates can make progress in their states with their legislatures. So we really started digging into this work with our Washington and California Insulin for All chapters back in 2020. As Chris said, at that time, California just passed the first of the 2 bills that would create the California program, SB 52. And that then had generated a lot of interest in our advocates in Washington state. Among them 2 absolute powerhouses, Maddie Johnson and Kevin Wren, were supporting SB 5203, which, when it passed in 2021, allowed Washington's healthcare authority to not only enter into cooperative PBMs with other states, state agencies, or nonprofits, but also to publicly produce and procure drugs. And so that legislation left the door open for public manufacturing in Washington or purchasing from other states. And in combination with what was happening in California, there was just a lot of interest and energy that led to this being a key campaign for us with our advocates. And as we've dug deeper into the different ways that states are approaching public pharma, with the help of the wonderful Christopher Morton and the student attorneys at the Science, Health, and Information Clinic at Columbia Law School, we found it really helpful to break kind of the umbrella of public pharma related to insulin down into like three approaches. And those are public PBMs, public procurement, and public manufacturing. And so what Washington currently has is a public PBM, which is known as ArrayRx. Public PBMs are using their pooled power to negotiate lower insulin prices. And then, because they're public, they're passing the savings not onto their, through rebates or back into shareholders, but 100% of the savings onto patients. And Washington and Oregon were the original members of that. And then Nevada joined on in 2022, and Connecticut just joined last month. So growing. And there's also public procurement, which involves bulk purchasing of insulin by public group purchasing by public group purchasing organizations, and then distributing to government healthcare facilities. Super similar to the PBM model, but it can involve the distribution piece in addition to negotiating the prices, which we know Washington has struggled with to support, because in their bill, SB 5203, they didn't have those funds explicitly appropriated in their legislation to support distribution. So I think just to name, like having those appropriations when you're considering any kind of legislative action, like the way that they're named in California to be 50 million will go in this contract, 50 million will go to the facility. That's really helpful to ensuring true implementation of these programs, because Washington right now has that legislative pathway paved to participate in public production, but they need money to do it. So that's the next step. So public PBMs and procurement, though, can serve as stepping stones for states to get involved as they're working towards more public production ideas as a longer term goal, because public production does take more resources, more knowledge and more intensive to implement. The public PBM and procurement strategies can be shorter term relief. And the thing with them, though, is they do still, at this point, they're still relying on contracting with for-profit drug companies. And that's where Civica as a nonprofit, as Chris mentioned, or public manufacturing from a state is still really playing a key role, because ultimately having public manufacturing to introduce the competition into the market and to strengthen those domestic supply chains and have a product that is ultimately, as Dana said, accountable to citizens and not to shareholders is what patient advocates want. And where we are with California right now, with the Civica CalRx kind of public-private partnership formalized back in March with the contract announcement, our role with our Insulin for All chapter now is to ensure that patient perspectives are continued to be considered at kind of every step of implementation in the program. We're informing the creation of a patient subcommittee to be part of distribution and equity conversations. And that work that's happening around how it will be distributed and how it will be done in an equitable way is something that will pave the way for other states. And I think that's another part of the process that is really exciting, because we have a chance, again, to think outside of the typical methods of distribution that we know just aren't working for patients, particularly with retail pharmacies that are so entwined with the current models. We heard from a lot of folks in March when, as Chris mentioned, the big three, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, Novo Nordisk, announced their price cuts, feeling like the insulin crisis was going to be solved. And what we're seeing already so far is that people aren't able to access the promised prices. Lilly's Insulin List Pro was supposed to be $25 as of May 1st, and most people are still not able to access it at the pharmacy counter and are being charged upwards of like over $100 when they try to get it. And so I think that's also what's really important about the CalRx Civica partnership, is that the insulin will be offered at that $30 price point without cards or paperwork to get there. Because what we see time and again, when there are those layers of getting to the true price, it rarely works for patients. And so I'll just say I'm happy to connect with anyone who's interested in pursuing this at the state level. We have advocates working across several states that I've already mentioned, and just really ask anyone who's considering it to think about having those patient voices that are most impacted at the table to talk through the needs around this when the process is being started.
Thank you so much, Allison. We are going to move on to Q&A, but first, there is a poll in the right side of your screen if you click from chat to polls, and we just shared the poll in the polls tab. And it is a way that you can share that you are interested in fighting for public pharma or interested just in keeping up with public pharma in your state. And if you fill that out, we'll be able to send you more info about this and get you ways you can contact and read more from each of these experts. So over in the poll tabs, let us know if you're keen to fight for public pharma in your state. Now on to questions. Keep dropping them in the chat, but I'll just start the ball rolling here in these final few minutes. Dana, there are many varieties of ways that this can work. Even in what I've heard from the panel so far, there are all these different angles on public pharma. Public pharma is not one thing, like raising the minimum wage to this level or lowering the voting age to this level. There are many institutional alternatives for it. Could you give us a little tour of, one sells, the other state buys, they all buy together, we go medicine by medicine, you have the public, pharmacy benefit, PBM, tell us a little bit about kind of the different ways public pharma is done.
Sure. Very briefly, I think ideally for some of us in the future, we'll have a system in which public sector actors at various levels engage in full cycle drug development. So that's discovering new medications and doing that in the public sector so that we're keeping the intellectual property in the public interest and not charging money and keeping other scientists and other people from discovering things based on that knowledge. We'll also have public production, which is what we focused on today, and which is probably the easiest and best thing to do at the state level for various reasons of scale, which is making the actual medicines in the public sector and again selling them hopefully at cost or below cost to meet public health needs. And then there's distribution. And all of these things have been done in the public sector in the United States and various countries around the world. We can happily send examples. And I think the good thing is that any and all of these initiatives would be positive. So I think in each state, there's a little bit of a discussion about what are our natural advantages here? Where do we want to make inroads? What other states are we working with? Where do we have the ability to collaborate and join forces? What's our value add as a state? Are we best placed to do some distribution? Are we best placed to do bulk, purchasing from public producers? Are we best placed to start producing medical devices because other states are producing medicines and we need them both? I think there's a huge range of options, and we're all happy to help discuss the finer points. If your state wants to look at legislation to forward one or more of those options, they're all desperately needed. And my dream would be in the future, we just kind of have an ecosystem of different municipalities, states, regions, and the federal government doing different pieces of this whole supply chain.
One more question, and Dana, if you want to jump in, or if others have seen it in their advocacy work, one of the strangest things that's happened with public pharma, because you turn on cable news and all you hear is that there's this giant divide between the two sides in America. And then if you're listening to this panel, you're thinking, oh, this might be one of the more radical policies. It's the government entering into the market. That seems a little out there. But yet, deep in tracks a lot of different policies. We follow a lot of policies on the cutting edge. And this is actually one of the ones where we're seeing some bipartisan interest. And so could any of you speak to, the fact that this is something that bridges divides in this country, especially when you get down to the concrete level of people saying, I want affordability in my medicine? What have you seen about kind of bipartisan interest in this, or people that surprisingly are interested in something like this that you might not have expected?
Yeah, I can say just a little bit. I think we're always very keen to remain nonpartisan in our work, because access to medicines, it doesn't need to be partisan. And we work with people across the aisle all the time in both parties. And I think one example of that, as Dina has pointed out, is with Utah. They made an insulin safety net program. And it's really because people, I think across all parties, are hearing how absurd the experience is with trying to get prescription drugs. And it's such a unanimous issue that people are struggling with this. And so that program was championed by a Republican, Norm Thurston, who was really passionate about creating that because it just wanted to save money for his constituents. And so worked really closely with our advocates in our Utah Insulin for All chapter to kind of hear the real needs there and create that program, which allows the state to give anybody essentially the discounts that the state is able to negotiate with that buying power of the full state behind them. And so, yeah, I think I don't think it needs to be partisan at all. I think everybody wants to be able to afford the medication they need to be well, and every party has voters that are being affected by this.
This is wonderful to see. It's a very practical solution. And so in many ways, I introduced it as, a strange thing is happening, but not strange at all when you have some legislators that are very interested in, finding real solutions to this, and this proves to be one. One other question for Dana is, this is not just about affordability, it's also about democracy. And I'd love, you're coming from the Democracy Collaborative, and I'd love to hear, a little bit on how it's not just about that we found this one quick fix to lower prices, but it's also there's power and flexibility and options in the future that comes when the public has in their own hands the power of production like this. So could you speak to that a bit?
Yes, super quickly. I mean, the big coup about the public sector is it's just more flexible than the private sector. You can design a public sector institution to meet any of a variety of needs that we have as a society, so that you can design a public pharma institution that has a super participatory board, and you can put Chris and Allison on your board as patients, and you should. We're working on trying to make sure that those sorts of things happen in California right now. the public sector in general is subject to more transparency legislation than the private sector in a lot of places. So there are more ways for us as the public, as constituents, as patients and consumers to participate in holding public sector institutions to account. But also, because we're removing that profit motive, there's the flexibility to design the institution so that it serves multiple public purposes, like creating jobs, which are an upstream investment in community health, but also things like greening the sector, right? And helping meet our climate goals. Healthcare is a huge emitter. So I think public institutions allow us to kind of look at a total public balance sheet and like, what are our goals as society, and help meet several of those at the same time. Chris and Allison, if you want to jump in, I think everybody can speak to this question.
If no takers on that, I have one more question I'll throw in these final 2 minutes to Chris, which is, and if Allison, you want to jump in afterwards, what are some tips, people in the chat or people in the audience want to champion this in their state. What are some tips and tricks, words of wisdom, words of experience you have about putting together a coalition and fighting for this? Like, what are some pitfalls to avoid? Anything you want to share on the brass tacks of the hand-to-hand combat of getting this passed?
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in from the California angle. I mean, everyone knows someone who struggles with prescription drug price affordability. So I think it's a very easy bridge to draw, but regardless of political affiliation. And you talk to anyone, anywhere, anytime, they could tell you that you say, oh man, my prescriptions are so affordable or so unaffordable, and they'll immediately jump on and say, yeah, you're right, that's unacceptable. So it's just become saturated in the zeitgeist that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. So when speaking to politicians, we try to bring in, and I talked about this earlier, there's been so many instances to try to regulate the pharma industry directly by trying to set price controls, set price caps at the state level. And that really has hit a firewall of lawsuits, litigation, challenges that hasn't really made too much progress. And so public manufacturing is an easy way around that whole firefight. It's a way to create, the state can invest, fairly modestly, considering the amount that at least California is paying for drugs like insulin. There's over 15 million people on the Medicaid program. You could say around maybe 3 million of those folks use insulin. And 40% of the state, right, is covered by this Medicaid program. So that's significant investment at the state level that's going into these essential medicines already. So it's a really logical cost-saving program for the state to be just putting a modest investment of $100 million for California. It could be less for smaller states to, work with an established biosimilar manufacturer like CalRx. That's the model, or like Civica RX. That's the model that we're pursuing. Not to say that other states could just skip that step and go directly to domestic public manufacturing, but it just makes economic sense, and it is enabling a solution that can be pursued now rather than just hitting the same firewall of going, hitting these pharma lobbyists and getting many other policies shot down. So I think it resonates well when you present it that way, and we're hopefully showing that CalRx can be successful to show that this can be brought to scale elsewhere.
Thank you, Chris, Allison, Dana. Thanks to all of you in the audience listening. Up next, we have 2 sessions, Run Local and Defending Direct Democracy. Click over to sessions on the left side to choose your next session, and hope you can fight for public pharma in your state and be in touch with our panel for any help, advice, resources that they can give you. So keep up the good fight, everyone. Thank you.